I first noticed my face disappearing on my 16th birthday. Mom had reframed the family portrait hanging in our hallway, the one from last Christmas at Grandma's estate. Only something was wrong. Where I once stood, shoulder to shoulder with my stepsister Vanessa, was now just Vanessa, her arm floating awkwardly where it had once rested on my shoulder. I'd been cropped out completely, like a mistake that needed correcting. Is there something wrong with the new family portrait? My mother asked, catching me staring at the frame. The prickle of her voice told me I was entering dangerous territory. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It's just, where am I? I managed to ask, keeping my voice steady despite the hurt swelling inside my chest. Mom's perfectly manicured nails tapped against the crystal wine glass in her hand. Cassandra, darling, you were squinting in that photo. It wasn't flattering. She took a deliberate sip, her burgundy lipstick leaving a crescent moon on the rim. Vanessa looked so beautiful. You know how important these appearances are for the family. By family, she meant Vanessa, my stepfather Richard, and herself. I was increasingly becoming an afterthought in the Mitchell-Hayes household. A remnant of Mom's first marriage, a living reminder of the life she had before she married into money and status. It wasn't always this way. For the first 12 years of my life, it had been just Mom and me against the world. We'd lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment, where she'd worked double shifts as a nurse to keep us afloat after my father died. Those years weren't easy, but they were ours. She would tuck me in every night, no matter how late her shift ran, and whisper that I was her little fighter. That was before Richard Mitchell walked into the emergency room with a broken wrist and left with my mother's phone number. Richard Mitchell, CEO of Mitchell Properties, one of the largest real estate development companies in the state. A widower with a daughter exactly my age. A man with a mansion on the hill, vacation homes in 3 countries, and enough money to make my mother's eyes sparkle in a way I'd never seen before. Vanessa and I had been thrown together at 14, expected to become instant sisters. At first we'd tried, but Vanessa, groomed since birth to be the Mitchell heiress, quickly realized I wasn't competition. I wasn't polished or sophisticated. I wore thrift store clothes while she had a personal shopper. I was bookish and quiet while she commanded every room. Most importantly, I wasn't a Mitchell. I just thought it was a nice photo of all of us, I said quietly, still staring at my absence in the frame. Grandma Eleanor liked it too. At the mention of Grandma Eleanor, Richard's mother, Mom's expression tightened. Well, we have a new portrait scheduled next month at the country club. Wear the blue dress I bought you. It minimizes your shoulders. She checked her diamond watch. Richard and Vanessa will be home from their trip soon. Have you finished your college applications? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The abrupt change of subject was typical. Whenever I brought up something uncomfortable, Mom would pivot to my future. College was her current obsession, specifically, getting me into one far enough, a way that my presence wouldn't disrupt the perfect Mitchell family image. Still working on them, I answered. Truth was, I'd finished my applications weeks ago, but I was keeping my options close. The further I got from this house, the better. The deadline for Westmore Community College is coming up, she reminded me, as if I didn't know. Westmore was 2 hours away, far enough to keep me out of family photos, close enough to maintain appearances. Richard has connections there. I nodded, not bothering to tell her I'd already applied to universities across the country. My grades were excellent, and thanks to Grandma Eleanor's secret tutoring sessions, my test scores were even better. The old woman might be Richard's mother, but she saw through the facade of our blended family better than anyone. Mom glided away toward the kitchen, her footsteps silent on the marble floors that still felt foreign beneath my feet even after 4 years. I took one last look at the doctored family photo before continuing down the hall to what had once been a guest room and was now my bedroom. My room was the smallest in the mansion, tucked away in the east wing, far from the main family quarters. I didn't mind the distance. My old life with Mom had been packed away like those photos she kept editing, existing but hidden. I closed the door behind me and pulled out my phone, scrolling to the original Christmas photo I'd saved. There I was, standing between Vanessa and Grandma Eleanor, my smile genuine because Eleanor had just whispered one of her sharp-witted jokes in my ear. Eleanor Mitchell was nothing like her son or granddaughter. At 82, she remained razor-sharp, with zero tolerance for pretension despite her family's wealth dating back generations. From the moment we met, Grandma Eleanor had taken a surprising interest in me. "You've got your father's eyes," she'd die, said during our first meeting, though she'd never met my dad. "Sharp, observant. You see things as they are, not as people pretend them to be." Over the years, while Mom transformed herself into the perfect Mitchell wife and Vanessa enjoyed her birthright, Eleanor became my unexpected ally. During mandatory Sunday lunches at her estate, she would find ways to separate me from the group. "Cassandra, dear, would you help me in the library?" she would call out, her voice frail but commanding. Once alone, the frailty would vanish. She would quiz me about books, politics, art, testing my mind while sharing her unfiltered opinions about everything, including her own family. "Richard was always easily impressed by beauty," she once told me while showing me a first edition Austen. "Your mother is clever to have caught him, but foolish to think becoming a Mitchell means erasing who she was." She'd fixed me with those piercing blue eyes. "Never let them erase you, Cassandra." Now, looking at the edited family photo, I wondered if it was too late for her advice. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend Zoe. "Still on for tomorrow? Mom says you can stay for dinner." I smiled, typing back, "Absolutely. Need to escape. The Mitchell madness." Zoe was the only person who understood my situation. We'd been friends since elementary school, long before Mom married into money. Zoe treated me exactly the same whether I lived in our old apartment or this cold mansion. Her home, a chaotic, loving household with 3 brothers and parents who worked as teachers, felt more like home than my actual residence. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the house, followed by Vanessa's laugh, musical and practiced to perfection. Richard and Vanessa were back from their father-daughter trip to Paris. Another experience I wasn't invited to share. I stayed in my room, counting to 100 slowly, giving them time to settle in before I made my obligatory appearance. The rules of the Mitchell household weren't written down, but I'd learned them through painful experience. Be present enough to appear part of the family, but never so present that you outshine Vanessa or inconvenience Richard. When I finally emerged, they were in the great room, the massive living space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the immaculately landscaped backyard. Richard was behind the bar fixing drinks, while Mom sat perched on the white leather sofa, smiling adoringly as Vanessa recounted their trip. "Daddy got us into the most exclusive restaurants," Vanessa was saying, her blonde hair catching the afternoon light. "The waiting list is usually months long, but the manager recognized him immediately." "Of course they did," Mom said, beaming at her stepdaughter with the kind of pride she used to reserve for me. "The Mitchell name opens doors everywhere." I cleared my throat softly, announcing my presence. 3 heads turned toward me, with varying degrees of enthusiasm. "Cassandra," Richard acknowledged with a nod. My stepfather was a handsome man in his early 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair and the confident posture of someone who'd never been told no. "How are your college applications coming along?" Always the same question. Never "how are you?" or "what have you been up to?" Just a focus on my eventual departure. "They're coming along fine," I answered, taking a seat in the armchair furthest, From the group, but still technically part of the circle. How was Paris? Magical, Vanessa sighed, though her eyes narrowed slightly as she looked at me. You wouldn't have appreciated it. You know how you get anxious in crowded places. I didn't, actually. That was a fiction Vanessa had created years ago when I was invited to a society event where she'd wanted to be the only daughter present. She'd told her father I suffered from social anxiety, and somehow that had become family lore, used to exclude me from countless functions since. I brought you something, Vanessa added, reaching into a shopping bag beside her. She pulled out a small box. A little Parisian souvenir. I accepted the box, aware of Mom and Richard watching the exchange with approving smiles. This was part of the performance. Vanessa's practiced generosity, designed to show what a wonderful stepsister she was. Inside the box was a cheap keychain of the Eiffel Tower, the kind sold at tourist kiosks for a few euros. Meanwhile, I could see the Chanel shopping bags by the door that undoubtedly contained Vanessa's real Parisian souvenirs. It's lovely, I said, slipping the keychain into my pocket. Thank you. Speaking of gifts, Richard said, setting down his scotch. Mother called while we were away. She wants the family at her estate this weekend. She says she has something important to discuss. The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly. Grandma Eleanor's important discussions were notorious. Last time, she'd announced she was donating $500,000 to a wildlife conservation fund instead of buying Richard's company a new corporate jet as he'd requested. Did she say what it was about? Mom asked, her voice carefully neutral. She'd never managed to charm Eleanor the way she had Richard. No, but she specifically requested Cassandra come early. Something about continuing your little book discussions. Richard said this dismissively, as if his mother's intellectual interests were a peculiar hobby rather than a sign of her formidable mind. Vanessa's smile tightened. Grandma and her books, so old-fashioned. I kept my expression neutral, though inside I felt a small flame of satisfaction. My relationship with Eleanor was the one thing Vanessa couldn't touch or diminish. Eleanor saw value in me that had nothing to do with the Mitchell name or fortune. I'll be there, I said simply. Later that night, as the house settled into silence, I sat by my window, looking out at the distant city lights. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When I opened it, I was surprised to see it was from Eleanor's personal assistant, Margaret. Miss Hayes, Mrs. Mitchell asks if you could come even earlier on Saturday. She suggests 9 a.m. instead of 11. She says it's important. I texted back my agreement. Curiosity piqued. Eleanor was usually meticulous about scheduling. A sudden change meant something significant. The next day at school passed in a blur. Westlake Preparatory Academy had been another adjustment after the Mitchell marriage, trading my public school for an elite private institution where most students arrived in luxury cars driven by chauffeurs. After 4 years, I'd carved out a small place for myself among the wealthy offspring, but I remained an outsider. The Hayes girl living in the Mitchell house, not quite belonging anywhere. You look like you need this more than me, Zoe said at lunch, sliding half her chocolate chip cookie toward me. Her curly hair was pulled into a messy bun, her uniform intentionally rumpled in a way that somehow looked stylish. Am I that obvious? I asked, taking the cookie gratefully. Your Mitchell family headache face is pretty distinctive, she replied. What happened now? Did Vanessa accidentally spill something on your homework again? I told her about the edited family photo and the cheap keychain souvenir, trying to keep my tone light, even though each incident was another paper cut on my heart. Your mom is seriously letting this happen? Zoe asked, her outrage on my behalf both comforting and painful. She's okay with you being literally erased? I shrugged, breaking the cookie into small pieces. She's been disappearing me in little ways for years. The photo is just the most literal version. And what does Queen Vanessa have to say about it? Probably her idea, I said. She's been working overtime to remind everyone she's the real Mitchell. College applications have her stressed. She needs to get into Bradley University because that's where all the Mitchell heirs go. While you're applying to places on the opposite coast, Zoe nodded, understanding. What about this weekend at Grandma Eleanor's? That sounds promising. I don't know. Eleanor's always been kind to me, but she's still Richard's mother. Family comes first for her. Just a different definition of family than what Mom and Vanessa practice. Zoe's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Maybe, but I remember what you told me she said about not letting them erase you. That doesn't sound like someone who's Team Mitchell all the way. The afternoon with Zoe at her house was the breath of fresh air I needed. The Chen's home was modest but warm. Photos covering the refrigerator, shoes piled by the door, the smell of Mrs. Chen's incredible. Cooking filling every room. Nobody posed or performed. Nobody pretended. "Cassandra!" Mrs. Chen exclaimed when I arrived, pulling me into a tight hug that made my eyes sting with unexpected tears. "Too skinny. Sit. Eat." Over dinner with the Chens, I could feel parts of myself returning, the parts that had been slowly disappearing at the Mitchell mansion. I laughed genuinely, shared opinions without calculating their reception, and forgot for a few hours about edited photos and Paris souvenirs. "You always welcome." "Here," Mr. Chen said earnestly as I was leaving. "Anytime. Our door open for you." The contrast between that warm farewell and the cold greeting I received back at the mansion was stark. Mom was hosting her book club, a group of society women who discussed the covers of books more than their contents, using the meetings as an excuse to drink wine and share gossip. "Cassandra," Mom said as I passed the formal living room where they were gathered. "Come say hello to everyone." I pasted on my polite smile and endured 5 minutes of the women's evaluating gazes and thinly veiled comparative comments between Vanessa and me. "College applications going well?" "I hear Vanessa's been accepted early decision to Bradley," said Mrs. Winters, whose daughter had been Vanessa's friend since preschool. "I'm still waiting to hear back from my applications," I said, neglecting to mention that Bradley hadn't been on my list. "Cassandra is very academic," Mom interjected with a tight smile. "We're exploring many options." The code was clear. Vanessa was following the prestigious Mitchell path while I was being directed elsewhere, anywhere that wouldn't intersect with the Mitchell legacy. I excused myself as quickly as politeness allowed and retreated to my room, where I spent the evening finalizing details for my upcoming visit to Eleanor's estate. Whatever she wanted to discuss with me privately had been occupying my thoughts all day. Saturday morning arrived with a pale winter sun glinting off the frost-covered grounds of the Mitchell estate. I'd woken early, careful to avoid the main family as I slipped downstairs. I needn't have worried. At 8 a.m., the house was silent. Richard and Mom never emerged before 9, and Vanessa would sleep until noon. I drove myself to Eleanor's estate in my modest used car, a stark contrast to the luxury vehicles that filled the Mitchell garage, but mine entirely, bought with savings. From the part-time job I'd kept secret from Mom and Richard. They would have been horrified at the thought of a Mitchell-adjacent person working retail, but the independence was worth their potential disapproval. Eleanor's estate sat on 50 acres of immaculately maintained grounds, centered around a historic mansion that had been in the Mitchell family for 4 generations. Unlike Richard's modern showcase home, Eleanor's residence was stately and substantial, filled with actual history rather than carefully curated appearances. Margaret, Eleanor's assistant for over 20 years, met me at the door. "She's waiting." "For you in the library, Miss Hayes. She's having one of her stronger days." This was Margaret's tactful way of saying that Eleanor's health was unpredictable lately. At 82, she remained mentally sharp, but her physical strength fluctuated dramatically, some days finding her bedridden, and others seeing her striding through her gardens with the energy of a much younger woman. I followed Margaret through the grand foyer. past walls adorned with Mitchell family portraits dating back a century. Unlike the pristine, color-coordinated photos in Richard's house, these paintings and photographs told real stories, ancestors with stern expressions and visible flaws, candid moments captured without perfect lighting or forced smiles. The massive library doors stood open, revealing Eleanor's sanctuary. 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes, first editions, and modern paperbacks alike. A spiral staircase connected to a wrought iron balcony that circled the upper level. The morning light streamed through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the antique Persian rug. Eleanor sat in her favorite wingback chair near the fireplace, a heavy book open on her lap. Her silver hair was styled in its usual elegant twist, and she wore a tailored navy dress that emphasized her still excellent posture. At first glance, she looked every bit the formidable matriarch of the Mitchell fortune. But as I drew closer, I noticed the new hollows beneath her sharp cheekbones, the increased prominence of the veins on her hands as they rested on the books. "Cover! There you are, Cassandra," she said, her voice still strong despite her frailer appearance. "Prompt as always. One of your many virtues the rest of them seem to overlook." "Good morning, Grandma Eleanor," I said, leaning down to kiss her papery cheek. She wasn't my biological grandmother, but she'd insisted I call her that from our first meeting, much to Vanessa's poorly concealed annoyance. "Sit, dear. Margaret, tea for Miss Hayes and privacy, please." Eleanor waited until Margaret had closed the library doors behind her before continuing. "How are you truly? And don't give me the polite answer you've been trained to provide at that house." I smiled, settling into the chair opposite her. "Honestly, I've been better. Mom had me edited out of the family Christmas portrait." Eleanor's eyes flashed with a familiar indignation. "Alexandra continues to disappoint me with her choices. Such a bright woman reduced to this desperate grasping at status." "She goes by Alexis now," I reminded her gently. My mother had officially changed her name from Alexandra to Alexis 2 years after marrying Richard, claiming the shorter form was more elegant. "And that," Eleanor said with a dismissive wave, "is precisely my point. Now, tell me about your college applications." The real list, not the community college nonsense Richard keeps mentioning. For the next 20 minutes, I shared my actual plans with Eleanor. The applications to universities in California, New York, even a few international options. Schools chosen for their excellent literature and history programs, not their connections to the Mitchell legacy. "Excellent choices," Eleanor nodded approvingly. "And your financial preparations?" This was another secret between us. Since my 16th birthday, Eleanor had been teaching me about financial independence, helping me establish accounts in my name that neither Mom nor Richard knew about. She hadn't funded them. "Handouts create dependence," she'd explained. But she'd shown me how to manage the money I earned from my hidden job, how to invest small amounts, how to build security independently. "Following your advice," I assured her. "The scholarship applications are submitted, and my savings account is growing steadily." "Good girl." She closed the book on her lap and set it aside. "Now, to the reason I asked you here early. I need to prepare you for what's coming." The seriousness in her tone made me sit straighter. "What is it?" "I've made changes to my will," she said without preamble. "Significant ones. They'll be announced to the family today, and there will be reactions." My stomach tightened with apprehension. The Mitchell fortune was substantial. Hundreds of millions accumulated over generations through real estate, investments, and old-fashioned entrepreneurship. Eleanor controlled the family trust and her personal fortune, which together represented the bulk of the family wealth. Richard's company was successful, but much of its growth had been funded by his mother's investments. "What kind of changes?" I asked carefully. "The kind that recognized true character over bloodlines." Her blue eyes, so like Richard's yet so different, in their perception, held mine steadily. "Cassandra, I've watched you these past 4 years. I've seen how Alexandra and Richard have treated you, like an inconvenient reminder of a life they'd rather forget. I've seen how Vanessa has systematically tried to push you out of every family frame. She reached for a leather portfolio on the side table and handed it to me. I'm 82 years old with a heart condition that's worsening by the month. The doctors give me perhaps a year, though I've always exceeded expectations. Her smile was wry. Before today's family meeting, I want you to understand exactly what I've done and why. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the portfolio. Inside was a document summary, not the full legal will, but a clear outline of its contents. As I scanned the pages, my breath caught. "Grandma Eleanor, this can't be right," I whispered, looking up at her in shock. "It's precisely right," she said firmly. "The main Mitchell family estate, this house and grounds, along with 40% of my personal holdings and controlling interest in the family trust, will pass to you upon my death." The numbers swam before my eyes. Tens of millions of dollars, property, stock portfolios, art collections. A fortune that would make me one of the wealthiest young women in the state overnight. "But Richard is your son. Vanessa is your granddaughter," I protested weakly. "Indeed they are. And they're provided for, though not to the extent they've been expecting." Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. "Richard receives his company shares outright and a significant portion of my liquid assets. Vanessa gets her trust fund, which is substantial. But you, Cassandra, will become the primary Mitchell heir." "They'll hate me," I whispered, the truth of this statement settling like a stone in my stomach. "More than they already do." "Perhaps," Eleanor conceded. "Or perhaps this will finally force them to see what I've seen all along, that the qualities that make a worthy custodian of the Mitchell legacy have nothing to do with carrying the Mitchell name." She leaned forward, her frail hand surprisingly strong as it gripped mine. "The Mitchell fortune wasn't built by people who edited others out of photos or gave cheap keychains as insulting souvenirs. It was built by people of substance, integrity, and vision, qualities I see in you, not in them." I tried to process the magnitude of what she was telling me. "When will you tell them?" "At lunch. The family attorney is joining us to explain the legal details." She settled back in her chair, a hint of the old mischief returning to her eyes. "I expect Richard will turn that particular shade of purple he gets when the country club changes their dinner menu without consulting him first." Despite my anxiety, I laughed at her accurate description of my stepfather's predictable outrage. "There's something else you should know," Eleanor continued, her tone growing serious again. "Alexandra, your mother, came to see me last month. She asked me to change my will to exclude you entirely." The words hit like a physical blow. What?" "She argued that since you weren't a Mitchell by blood, you shouldn't receive any Mitchell inheritance. She suggested that any funds I might have considered for you should instead go to Vanessa's future children, to keep the bloodline strong, as she put it." I felt sick. The mother who had once worked double shifts to buy me a special birthday cake was now actively working to cut me out of financial opportunities. The transformation was complete. She had fully abandoned her old life and the daughter who reminded her of it. "What did you tell her?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "I told her," Eleanor said with steel in her voice, "that I would make my own decisions about my money, based on my own assessments of character. I reminded her that she hadn't been born a Mitchell either, yet had no qualms about enjoying Mitchell money." Her eyes softened as she looked at me. "And I told her she was a fool who didn't deserve the remarkable daughter she had." Tears threatened, but I blinked them back. "Thank you for telling me the truth." "Always, my dear. The truth is messy and painful, but concealing it only creates deeper wounds." She glanced at the ornate clock on the mantel. "The others will be arriving soon. Margaret will show you to the blue sitting room where you can collect yourself before lunch. I've asked her to bring you some tea. Something calming with your nerves, I expect." As I stood to leave, Eleanor caught my hand once more. Remember, Cassandra, this isn't about the money. It's about recognizing worth. Your worth. Something your mother has forgotten how to see. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat, and made my way to the door. Just as I reached it, Eleanor called after me. And Cassandra? When they react, and they will react badly, remember that their anger comes from entitlement, not injustice. You owe them no apologies for being recognized. The blue sitting room was a small, elegant space with windows overlooking Eleanor's famous rose gardens, now dormant in the winter chill. I sat with my tea, trying to prepare myself for the storm that was coming. The document summary remained in the leather portfolio, which I'd placed on the table beside me, its presence both reassuring and terrifying. Margaret knocked softly at the door an hour later. "They've arrived, Miss Hayes. Mrs. Mitchell asks that you join them in the dining room in 15 minutes. I thanked her, my heart beginning to race. Through the window, I could see Richard's black Mercedes and Mom's white Range Rover in the circular driveway. They had arrived separately, as they often did for family functions, Richard claiming business calls needed privacy, Mom using the excuse of different schedules. In reality, they both enjoyed making their own grand entrances. Taking a deep breath, I smoothed down the simple but elegant blue dress I'd chosen for the day. One of the few designer items I owned, a birthday gift from Eleanor, rather than Mom's. Usual selections that were always slightly too tight or too juvenile. I tucked the portfolio into my small handbag, squared my shoulders, and headed toward the dining room. I could hear them before I saw them. Vanessa's practiced laugh, Richard's booming voice recounting some business triumph, Mom's affirming responses, at perfect intervals. The performance of the perfect Mitchell family was well underway. As I entered the dining room, the conversation stuttered briefly before resuming. The room was magnificent, as always. The gleaming mahogany table set for 6 with Eleanor's finest china and crystal. Fresh flowers arranged in the center. Winter sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her posture regal despite her diminished frame. Richard was at her right hand, with Mom beside him, both dressed as if for a photo shoot rather than a family lunch. Vanessa sat at Eleanor's left, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. The empty seat beside her was clearly meant for me, while an older gentleman in a conservative suit, presumably the family attorney, sat at the far end. "Cassandra, there you are," Eleanor said warmly. "Everyone, I believe you know Mr. Harrington, who has managed the Mitchell legal affairs for 30 years. Murmured greetings circled the table as I took my seat beside Vanessa, who shifted slightly away as if my public school origins might be contagious. "Did you and Grandma have a nice chat about books this morning?" she asked, her tone suggesting that nothing could possibly be more boring. "Among other things," I replied neutrally. Lunch proceeded with the usual Mitchell family dynamics, Richard dominating the conversation with talk of business deals and social connections, Mom playing the adoring wife while subtly highlighting Vanessa's latest achievements, Vanessa alternating between false modesty and thinly veiled self-promotion. Eleanor observed it all with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes, occasionally exchanging glances with me that spoke volumes. Mr. Harrington ate silently, responding politely when addressed but otherwise remaining professionally detached. He knew what was coming, I realized. He'd probably drafted the documents himself. As the dessert plates were being cleared, Eleanor tapped her water glass gently. The soft chime brought immediate silence. "Thank you all for coming today," she began, her voice strong despite her frail appearance. "As you know, I don't call these family meetings without purpose. Mr. Harrington is here because I've recently made significant changes to my will and the Mitchell family trust arrangements, and I believe in transparency about such matters while I'm still here to explain my decisions." Richard's expression shifted from casual interest to sharp focus. Mom's smile froze in place. Vanessa straightened in her chair, suddenly attentive. I kept my eyes on my folded hands, feeling their sidelong glances. Mother is everything all, right? Richard asked, his concern sounding genuine, though I knew it was at least partly for the benefit of Mr. Harrington. Your health. My health is exactly why we're having this conversation, Richard, Eleanor interrupted crisply. At 82 with a heart condition, I'm being realistic about time. Now, to business. She nodded to Mr. Harrington, who opened his briefcase and distributed sealed envelopes to everyone at the table. These contain summaries of the relevant provisions, Eleanor explained. The complete legal documents are, of course, on file with Mr. Harrington's firm. I'll give you a moment to review the highlights before we discuss. The sound of tearing paper filled the room as everyone opened their envelopes. I left mine sealed, already knowing its contents. Instead, I watched the others' faces as they read. Richard went exactly the shade of purple Eleanor had predicted. Mom's complexion, by contrast, drained of all color, her perfectly manicured hand trembling slightly as she held the paper. Vanessa's expression transformed from expectant to shocked to furious in the span of seconds. Mother, this must be some kind of mistake, Richard said, his voice dangerously quiet. No mistake, Richard, Eleanor replied calmly. Mr. Harrington has reviewed everything thoroughly. The documents are legally sound. But this can't be what you want, Mom interjected, her voice higher than usual. To leave the bulk of your estate to... She couldn't bring herself to say my name, instead gesturing vaguely in my direction. To Cassandra, Eleanor finished firmly. Yes, that is precisely what I want. Vanessa slammed her paper down on the table. She's not even a Mitchell. I'm your granddaughter. Your only blood granddaughter. Blood isn't everything, Vanessa, Eleanor said, unruffled by the outburst. Character matters more. The decisions I've made reflect my assessment of who will best honor and extend the Mitchell legacy. This is absurd, Richard said, color still high in his face. Cassandra is barely part of this family. Alexandra and I have discussed sending her to community college next year because she clearly doesn't have the social acumen to... Richard, Eleanor cut him off sharply. Be very careful about what you say next. Mr. Harrington is taking notes, and your comments may be relevant should you choose to contest my will after my death. That silenced him momentarily. He drew a deep breath, visibly trying to regain his composure. Mother, we simply want to understand your thinking here. Cassandra has only been adjacent to the family for 4 years. The Mitchell estate has been in our bloodline for generations. And it will remain in good hands, Eleanor countered. I've watched all of you these past 4 years. I've seen how you've treated Cassandra as an inconvenience, an embarrassment, someone to be edited out of family photos. Her pointed glance at Mom made it clear she knew about the Christmas portrait. Meanwhile, I've seen Cassandra's intelligence, her integrity, her resilience in the face of your constant belittlement. She turned to face me directly. Cassandra has shown me that she understands the responsibility that comes with privilege, something the rest of you seem to have forgotten. This is because of those stupid books, isn't it? Vanessa snapped, turning on me with naked hostility. Playing the perfect little intellectual with Grandma while the rest of us had actual responsibilities. What responsibilities? Eleanor asked, with a raised eyebrow. Your shopping expeditions? Your social media influencer attempts? Your barely passing grades at schools where your father donates buildings? Vanessa flushed dark red. That's not fair. I work hard for my position in society. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is maintaining the right image? The right connections? Eleanor's expression remained unmoved. The Mitchell fortune wasn't built on maintaining the right image, Vanessa. It was built on innovation, intelligence, and moral courage, qualities I see in abundance in Cassandra and find lacking in you. Mother, please, Richard interjected, his tone shifting to conciliatory. This is unnecessarily harsh. Vanessa has been raised to represent the Mitchell name in society. She's following the path we set for her. Perhaps that's the problem, Eleanor replied. The path you've set has more to do with appearances than substance. She turned to Mom, who sat rigid and pale. Alexis, you've been quiet. What are your thoughts? All eyes turned to my mother. I held my breath. Some small, childish part of me still hoping she might defend me, might remember that before she was Alexis Mitchell, she had been Alexandra Hayes, my mother and only family. Mom's hands smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her silk blouse. I think, she said carefully, that this decision puts Cassandra in an impossible position. She's not equipped for this level of responsibility or scrutiny. Her eyes finally met mine, and I saw something close to desperation in them. Cassandra, sweetheart, you must see how this would overwhelm you. You're just not prepared for this world. The words stung worse than Vanessa's open hostility or Richard's dismissiveness. Mom still couldn't bring herself to advocate for me, directly. Even now, she was framing her objections as concern for my well-being rather than admitting what everyone knew, that she wanted the Mitchell fortune to go to her new family, not her original one. Actually, I said, finding my voice at last, I've been preparing for years. Grandma Eleanor has been teaching me about finance, property management, and philanthropic responsibility since I was 16. Shock registered on all three of their faces. They'd been so busy dismissing me that they'd never noticed what was happening right under their noses. You're not seriously considering accepting this, are you? Vanessa demanded, turning to me with narrowed eyes. This should be my inheritance, my birthright. Birthright? Eleanor repeated with a scoff. Listen to yourself, Vanessa. We're not medieval royalty. Wealth is a responsibility, not a divine right granted by birth. Mrs. Mitchell, Mr. Harrington interjected smoothly, speaking for the first time since distributing the envelopes. Perhaps it would be helpful to explain your specific reasoning for the distribution as outlined. For the record, he added, nodding, toward his small recording device on the table. Of course, Edward. Eleanor straightened in her chair. The Mitchell fortune has always been directed toward those who demonstrate the capacity to use it wisely and for the greater good. My late husband believed this, as did his father before him. Richard, she turned to her son, you have consistently shown interest only in the superficial trappings of wealth, the status, the luxury, the influence it buys. You've used the family money to prop up your own company rather than innovate, or contribute meaningfully to society. Richard's jaw tightened, but he remained silent under Mr. Harrington's watchful eye. Vanessa, Eleanor continued, you've been raised without any concept of hard work or purpose beyond self-promotion. Your grades are purchased, not earned. Your social standing is inherited, not developed through character or contribution. She turned to my mother next. Alexandra, you've abandoned your own identity and values to chase status through marriage. Worse, you've rejected your own daughter for not fitting the artificial image you're trying to cultivate. Finally, she looked at me, her expression softening. Cassandra, meanwhile, has maintained her integrity despite constant undermining. She's excelled academically on her own merits. She's held a job. Yes, I know about that, she added as Mom's eyes widened in surprise. She's demonstrated financial responsibility with the modest means at her disposal. Most importantly, she's shown compassion and perspective that the Mitchell wealth desperately needs in its next custodian. The silence that followed was dense with tension. I could almost see the calculations happening behind Richard's eyes as he processed this public dressing down and considered his options. Mother, he finally said, his voice artificially calm, you're clearly passionate about this decision. But I think we should discuss this privately, as a family, without outside parties. He glanced meaningfully at Mr. Harrington. Mr. Harrington stays, Eleanor said firmly, and my decision is final. The documents are signed and filed. You can't do this to us, Vanessa burst out. Tears of rage or manipulation. It was always hard to tell with her, welling in her eyes. Daddy, tell her she can't do this. Actually, Mrs. Mitchell absolutely can distribute her assets as she sees fit, Mr. Harrington replied mildly. The Mitchell Family Trust has specific provisions that give the current trustee, your grandmother, significant discretion in determining succession. Mom reached for her water glass with a visibly trembling hand. Eleanor, please, think about what this will do to our family, to our standing in the community. I've thought about nothing else for months, Alexandra, Eleanor replied. And I've concluded that the standing you're so concerned about has corrupted this family's values beyond recognition. Richard pushed back from the table abruptly. This isn't over, Mother. You're elderly and clearly being influenced by— He shot me a venomous look. Outside parties with their own agendas. Careful, Richard, Mr. Harrington warned. Allegations of undue influence without evidence could be problematic if you're considering legal action. Richard ignored him, turning to Mom and Vanessa. We're leaving, now. But Daddy, Vanessa began. Now, Vanessa, he repeated, his tone brooking no argument. Mom stood up slowly, her social training preventing her from making a scene despite the circumstances. Eleanor, I hope you'll reconsider, for all our sakes. She turned to me, and I saw confusion and hurt warring with anger in her eyes. Cassandra, come with us. We need to discuss this as a family. The word family from her lips now seemed hollow, a convenience invoked only when it served her purposes. For 4 years I'd been adjacent to their family, not truly part of it. I think I'll stay, I said quietly. Grandma Eleanor and I have more to discuss. Mom's face hardened, the last traces of maternal concern vanishing. I see you've made your choice. No, Mom, I replied, surprising myself with my steadiness. You made the choice 4 years ago when you decided I wasn't Mitchell material. I'm just finally accepting it. Without another word, the three of them swept from the room, leaving me alone with Eleanor and Mr. Harrington. The heavy front door slammed moments later, followed by the sounds of cars starting and gravel crunching as they drove away. Eleanor released a long breath. Well, that went about as expected. Slightly. Better, actually, Mr. Harrington remarked, stopping his recording. Richard didn't explicitly threaten legal action, which is promising. He'll try something, Eleanor said confidently. I know my son. But we've prepared for that, haven't we, Edward? Extensively, Mrs. Mitchell, the lawyer confirmed, beginning to gather his papers. Miss Hayes, I'll be in touch soon to begin. Your orientation to the Mitchell holdings. Mrs. Mitchell has arranged for you to shadow me for the next several months to learn the practical aspects of managing the estate. My head was spinning. What happens now? Now, Eleanor said, reaching for my hand across the table. We prepare you properly, and we weather the storm that's coming. Mr. Harrington excused himself shortly after, leaving Eleanor and me alone in the vast dining room. Margaret appeared silently to clear the barely touched dessert plates. Tea in the library, Margaret, Eleanor requested. And perhaps something stronger for me. A small sherry wouldn't go amiss after that performance. Once we were settled back in the library, Eleanor sipping her sherry while I cradled a cup of tea, she regarded me thoughtfully. You're holding up remarkably well, she observed. I expected tears, at minimum. I smiled faintly. They'll come. Later, I'm sure. Right now, I'm still in shock. About the inheritance or about your mother's reaction? Both, I admitted. Though I shouldn't be surprised by Mom anymore. She's been disappearing me bit by bit for years. Eleanor nodded slowly. Alexandra was a good mother to you once, wasn't she? Before Richard? The question opened a flood of memories. Mom reading me bedtime stories after double shifts, saving for months to buy me a special dress for a school dance, holding me through the night when I had childhood fevers. The contrast with the woman who had just walked out made my throat tighten. Yes, I whispered. She was everything to me. We were a team. Money changes people, Eleanor said softly. Or rather, it reveals what was already there, hidden beneath the surface. Richard's father had concerns about him from an early age, his sense of entitlement, his focus on status rather than contribution. I should have heeded those concerns more carefully. She set down her sherry glass. Your mother, I think, had always craved security and status but had neither. When Richard offered both, she seized the opportunity. The tragedy is that she was willing to sacrifice you to maintain her new position. What will they do now? I asked, dreading the answer. In the short term, make your life at the house extremely uncomfortable. Richard will consult with lawyers about challenging the will, but will find that difficult given the precautions we've taken. Your mother will likely try to emotionally manipulate you into rejecting the inheritance. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. Which brings me to an important question. Are you prepared to accept what I'm offering you, Cassandra? Not just the money and property, but the responsibility and the inevitable backlash? I took a deep breath, considering her question. Seriously, the inheritance would give me freedom and security beyond anything I'd imagined. It would fund my education, allow me to pursue my passions without financial constraints, give me the power to make a difference in causes I cared about. But it would also make me a target of resentment from Richard and Vanessa, of manipulative attempts from Mom, of gold diggers and opportunists who would see me only as an ATM with legs. I don't know if I'm prepared, I answered honestly, but I want to be. I want to learn, and I won't let them intimidate me out of this opportunity. Eleanor's smile was warm with approval. That's precisely why you're the right choice, my dear. Now, let's talk practical matters. I don't think you should return to Richard's house tonight. The thought of facing the three of them, their anger still fresh, made my stomach clench. I could stay with Zoe. Her parents have always said their guest room is open to me. A good short-term solution, Eleanor agreed. But you'll need a permanent residence soon. Richard won't allow you to continue living under his roof once he fully processes what's happened today. I'm 18, I reminded her. I could get an apartment near whatever college accepts me. You could? She acknowledged. Or you could consider moving in here. This house will be yours eventually, and there's certainly room for both of us in the meantime. It would give us time for a proper transition of knowledge. The offer was unexpected but immediately appealing. Eleanor's house, despite its grandeur, had always felt more like a home to me than the Mitchell mansion. Here, books were actually read rather than displayed for show. Conversations had substance. Appearances weren't the primary concern. I'd like that, I said. If you're sure it wouldn't be an imposition. An imposition? My dear, it would be a delight. Margaret will be thrilled to have someone who actually eats her cooking instead of pushing it around the plate while worrying about calories. Eleanor's eyes twinkled. We can send for your things tomorrow. For tonight, the Blue Guest Suite is already prepared with everything you might need. For the first time since reading the inheritance document, I felt a bubble of something like excitement, rising through the anxiety. A new beginning, a chance to define myself outside of the Mitchell shadow. There's one more thing you should know, Eleanor said, her expression growing more serious. The changes to my will aren't the only preparations I've made. There's a letter in the portfolio I gave you, sealed, at the back. It contains information about your father. My heart seemed to stop momentarily. My father? But he died when I was a baby. Mom said she hardly had any information about him. Your mother has never been particularly committed to the truth when a convenient fiction serves her purposes better, Eleanor said dryly. The letter explains everything I've been able to discover. I hired investigators. Discreetly, of course. My hands trembled as I reached for my bag. pulling out the portfolio and finding the sealed envelope at the back. Should I read it now? That's entirely up to you, Eleanor replied gently. It's not going anywhere. Read it when you feel ready. I stared at the envelope, torn between desperate curiosity and fear of what it might contain. Mom had always been vague about my father, claiming he'd been a brief relationship that ended before she knew she was pregnant, and that he'd died in an accident shortly after I was born. I had no photos of him, no stories, not even a clear sense of what he'd looked like beyond Mom's occasional comment that I had his eyes or his stubborn chin. Later, I decided, returning the envelope to the portfolio. I need to process one life-changing revelation at a time. Eleanor nodded approvingly. Wise decision. Now, I suggest you call your friend Zoe and update her on today's developments. I suspect you'll need the support of people who care about you genuinely in the days ahead. I spent the remainder of the afternoon in the blue guest suite, soon to be my room, alternating between moments of stunned disbelief and practical planning. Zoe's reaction to my news had been predictably supportive and outraged on my behalf. They what? She'd practically shouted when I told her about Mom asking Eleanor to cut me out of the will completely. That's Shakespeare-level family betrayal. It gets worse, I'd replied, telling her about being edited out of the family Christmas photo. Move in with Grandma Eleanor immediately, Zoe had advised firmly. Like, tonight. Don't give them another chance to mess with you. I'd already decided to take Eleanor's offer, but Zoe's emphatic support confirmed it was the right choice. I called Mom's cell phone, prepared to inform her that I wouldn't be returning to the Mitchell house, but the call went straight to voicemail. I left a brief, factual message. Mom, I'm staying at Grandma Eleanor's tonight. I'll arrange to collect my things tomorrow. No emotion, no accusations, no pleas. Just information, delivered in the same detached tone she'd used with me for years. It felt foreign on my tongue, but necessary for self-preservation. As evening settled over the estate, I found myself drawn back to the library. The vast room was softly lit now, table lamps creating pools of warm light among the shadows. Eleanor sat in her usual chair, a different book open before her, though she didn't seem to be reading it. Ah, Cassandra, she said, looking up as I entered. I was just thinking about you. Have you made your arrangements? Yes, I said, settling into the chair opposite hers. Zoe knows everything, and I left Mom a message saying I'm staying here tonight. Good. Margaret has prepared the blue suite properly now, and she's laid out some night clothes that should fit you. Tomorrow we can send Bryant to collect your essentials from Richard's house. Bryant was Eleanor's driver and general assistant, a retired military man who managed the estate's security and transportation needs with quiet efficiency. Thank you, I said, then hesitated before asking the question that had been circling my mind all afternoon. Grandma Eleanor, what happens if they contest the will? Can they take all of this away? Eleanor's expression turned contemplative. They can try, certainly. Richard will undoubtedly consult with expensive lawyers who will tell him what he wants to hear. But Edward Harrington has been protecting Mitchell interests for 3 decades. He's anticipated every possible challenge. She leaned forward slightly. The provisions of my will are legally sound. I've had multiple psychological evaluations confirming my mental competence. The Mitchell Family Trust has specific provisions that give the trustee broad discretion in succession planning. Richard knows all this, which is why he'll likely try other methods first. What other methods? I asked, alarmed by her certainty. Social pressure, financial manipulation, emotional blackmail. Eleanor ticked off the strategies on her slender fingers. Richard has always believed that everyone has a price, that principles can be negotiated away for the right incentive or under enough pressure. She studied me with those piercing blue eyes. That's why I've spent these years preparing you, Cassandra. not just with financial knowledge, but by strengthening your sense of self-worth. Richard and Alexandra will try to make you believe you don't deserve this inheritance, that you're not capable of handling it, that you're being selfish by accepting it. The accuracy of her prediction was unnerving. I could already hear Mom's voice in my head. Think about what this is doing to the family, Cassandra, to Vanessa's future. Is money really worth destroying relationships? I won't let them manipulate me, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I know you won't, Eleanor replied with a small smile. That's precisely why you're sitting here now. A soft knock at the library door interrupted us. Margaret stood in the doorway, her usually composed face showing signs of strain. Excuse me, Mrs. Mitchell, Miss Hayes. Mr. Mitchell is at the front gate, demanding to be let in. He's quite insistent. Eleanor and I exchanged looks. Sooner than I expected, she remarked. Is he alone, Margaret? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Mitchell and Miss Vanessa are not with him. Bryant is keeping him at the gate for now, but Mr. Mitchell is threatening to call the police if he's not allowed to see his mother. Eleanor sighed. Dramatic as always. Very well. Margaret, tell Bryant to let him in and escort him to the formal sitting room, not the library, she added firmly. As Margaret left to relay the instructions, Eleanor turned to me. You don't have to be present for this, Cassandra. Richard will be looking to create a scene, and you've had enough drama for one day. Part of me wanted to hide, to avoid another confrontation. But a stronger part, perhaps the part that made Eleanor believe in me, refused to be intimidated. I'd like to stay, I said. If that's all right with you. She nodded approvingly. In that case, let's not keep Richard waiting. He's always been impatient. The formal sitting room was rarely used, a beautifully appointed space reserved for important visitors rather than family gatherings. As we entered, I could see Richard pacing before the marble fireplace, his expensive suit slightly rumpled, his normally perfect hair disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. He turned sharply at our entrance, his expression darkening further when he saw me beside his mother. So it's true, he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. You've moved her in already, not even waiting until you're gone to replace your own family. Richard, please sit down, Eleanor said calmly, indicating the armchairs flanking the fireplace. This conversation will be more productive if we're all civilized. Civilized? Richard laughed harshly. There's nothing civilized about what you've done, Mother. Disinheriting your own granddaughter in favor of… He gestured dismissively toward me. Her? What would Father say? Your father would recognize the same qualities in Cassandra that I do, Eleanor replied, settling herself in one of the chairs. I took the seat beside her while Richard remained standing, using his height in a subtle attempt at intimidation. Harrison valued character and integrity above bloodlines. You seem to have forgotten that. This isn't about character, Richard snapped. This is about you trying to control me through my daughter's inheritance, just like you've always tried to control me through the family money. Eleanor's eyebrow arched. Is that what Alexandra told you? That this is about controlling you? Interesting theory. Richard's gaze shifted to me. And you. I welcomed you into my home, provided for you, treated you like family. I couldn't help the disbelieving scoff that escaped me. Treated me like family? You've spent 4 years trying to erase me from your perfect Mitchell picture. Just last week, Mom edited me out of the Christmas photo. Don't pretend this is about family loyalty. You ungrateful little… Richard caught himself, visibly struggling for control. You've clearly been poisoning my mother against us for years, with your poor little stepsister act. What did you tell her? What lies have you been spreading in these little book discussions? Cassandra has never said a negative word about any of you, Eleanor interjected firmly. She didn't need to. I have eyes, Richard. I've seen how Alexandra has systematically pushed her own daughter aside to elevate Vanessa. I've seen how you've treated Cassandra as an inconvenience rather than a member of your household. That's absurd, Richard protested, but his eyes slid away from his mother's penetrating gaze. We've given her every advantage. Every advantage except acceptance, Eleanor countered. Every advantage except belonging. Every advantage except love. The word hung in the air between us. Love. The element that had been missing from the Mitchell household since the day Mom married Richard. Richard changed tactics, his voice softening as he turned to me. Cassandra, this doesn't have to be adversarial. You're young. You don't need the burden of managing a massive estate. The Mitchell holdings are complex, demanding. There are better ways to secure your future without tearing the family apart. Such as? I asked, hearing Eleanor's prediction about financial negotiation playing out exactly as she'd anticipated. A generous trust, Richard offered immediately. Enough to fund your education at any university, buy a comfortable home, ensure you never have financial worries. All we ask in return is that you respect the family's traditional succession plan. The main estate and business holdings would pass to Vanessa as has always been expected. Before I could respond, Eleanor interjected. And there it is, the negotiation, the attempt to buy what you believe is for sale. She shook her head sadly. Richard, you still don't understand. This isn't about money. It's about legacy and responsibility. You're manipulating her, Richard said, his momentary calm evaporating. Using her to punish me for some imagined failing. She's 18, Mother. She has no concept of what managing the Mitchell estate entails, which is why she'll have proper guidance and mentorship, Eleanor replied evenly. Unlike Vanessa, Cassandra is willing to learn, to work, to earn her position rather than simply expecting it as a birthright. Richard's face hardened. This isn't over, not by a long shot. If you won't be reasonable, we'll explore other options. Are you threatening legal action, Richard? Eleanor asked, her tone suddenly cooler. Because I should remind you that the Mitchell Family Trust has very specific provisions about contests to succession plans. Anyone challenging the trustee's designated successor automatically forfeits their own share. This was information I hadn't known, and from Richard's momentary expression of shock, it was either new to him as well or something he'd forgotten. That's barbaric, he sputtered. That's your grandfather's foresight, Eleanor corrected. He understood that wealth can bring out the worst in families. The provision was designed to prevent exactly this kind of infighting. Richard's jaw worked as he processed this new obstacle. Alexandra will never accept this, he finally said. Cassandra is her daughter. She has influence over her that you couldn't possibly match. The statement was so wildly disconnected from reality that I couldn't help laughing. Mom has spent the last 4 years systematically erasing me from her life, Richard. She literally asked Grandma Eleanor to cut me out of the will entirely. What influence are you talking about? Richard's eyes narrowed. She told you about that conversation? I tell Cassandra the truth, Eleanor said simply. Something the rest of you might try occasionally. Richard seemed to realize he was making no progress. His expression shifted to cold disdain. You'll regret this choice, Mother. Both of you will. He turned to me, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You think you've won some great victory today, Cassandra? Just wait. You have no idea what's coming. With that parting threat, he strode from the room without another word, his footsteps echoing through the grand hallway. Moments later, we heard the front door slam and his car engine roar to life. Eleanor released a long breath. Well, that was predictable, if unpleasant. He threatened me, I said, still processing Richard's parting words. Both of us, really. Richard has always confused intimidation with strength, Eleanor replied, reaching over to pat my hand reassuringly. His threats are primarily bluster, but we should still be prudent. She pulled out her cell phone and made a brief call. Bryant, Richard has just left. Please review the security protocols we discussed and implement them immediately. Yes, all of them. Thank you. As she ended the call, I asked, Security protocols? Nothing dramatic, Eleanor assured me. Changing the gate access codes, activating the property's surveillance system, informing the estate staff to be vigilant about unexpected visitors. Standard precautions. The casual way she described these measures made me realize how normal family conflict must be in wealthy circles, complete with security protocols and legal contingencies. "Do you think he'll really try something?" I asked, unable to keep the worry from my voice. "Richard will explore every option, from legal challenges to social pressure to financial incentives," Eleanor said confidently. "But he's fundamentally a coward, Cassandra. When he realizes he can't intimidate or buy his way out of this situation, he'll eventually adjust to the new reality." She stood slowly, the evening's tensions clearly taking a toll on her energy. "It's been quite a day. I think we both need rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." As I lay in the luxurious guest bed that night, soon to be my bed in my new home, sleep eluded me. The events of the day played on repeat in my mind. The shock on Richard and Vanessa's faces, the cold betrayal in Mom's eyes, Richard's threatening, final words. But beneath the anxiety ran a current of something unfamiliar, a sense of validation. For 4 years, I'd been treated as less than, an inconvenient remnant of Mom's previous life. Today, Eleanor had seen me, truly seen me, and declared me worthy in the most dramatic way possible. The sealed letter about my father lay on the nightstand, still unopened. Whatever truths it contained would have to wait for another day. One life-altering revelation at a time, as I'd told Eleanor. Eventually, I drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of edited family photos where my image slowly faded back into existence, while others disappeared around me. Morning arrived with pale winter sunlight and the distant sounds of the estate coming to life. Staff arriving, deliveries being made, the normal rhythm of a household that operated on a scale I was still adjusting to comprehend. A gentle knock at my door revealed Margaret, bearing a breakfast tray. "Good morning, Miss Hayes. Mrs. Mitchell thought you might prefer breakfast in your room today. She'll meet you in the library at 10 if that suits you." The tray held fresh fruit, warm croissants, and a pot of hot chocolate. A thoughtful touch, as Eleanor had noticed my preference for chocolate over coffee during our Sunday lunches. "Thank you, Margaret. And please call me Cassandra." Margaret's professional demeanor softened slightly. "Very well, Cassandra. There's something else you should know. Mrs. Mitchell received calls this morning from both your mother and Miss Vanessa. They were quite insistent about speaking with you." My appetite diminished immediately. "What did they want?" "They didn't share specific details with me, but Mrs. Mitchell asked me to tell you that you're under no obligation to speak with them until you're ready. The decision is entirely yours." The consideration behind this message brought unexpected tears to my eyes. For so long, my feelings and preferences had been secondary considerations in the Mitchell household, if they were considered at all. "Thank you," I managed. "I'll think about it." After breakfast, I took a long shower in the ensuite bathroom, letting the hot water wash away some of the tension from yesterday. The blue guest suite was larger than my bedroom at Richard's house, with a sitting area, walk-in closet, and a bathroom that featured both a rainfall shower and a soaking tub. Like the rest of Eleanor's house, it was luxurious without being ostentatious. Quality materials and craftsmanship, rather than flashy design elements. As I dressed in clothes borrowed from the guest suite's closet, somehow in exactly my size, Eleanor's foresight at work again, I considered whether to call Mom back. What would I even say to her? To Vanessa? The wounds were still too raw, the betrayal too fresh. At 10 o'clock precisely, I made my way to the library, finding Eleanor already settled in her customary chair, a stack of folders on the table beside her. "Good morning, Cassandra," she greeted me, looking remarkably refreshed considering yesterday's drama. "I trust you slept eventually?" "Eventually," I confirmed with a small smile. "Margaret mentioned that Mom and Vanessa called." Indeed, they did. Your mother was remarkably controlled, though I could hear the tension beneath her social veneer. Vanessa was less restrained, quite emotional, actually. Eleanor's tone made it clear what she thought of emotional outbursts. I informed them, both that you're staying here indefinitely and that any communication with you would be at your discretion. How did they take that? About as well as you might expect. Alexandra insisted that as your mother, she has a right to speak with you. I reminded her that you're 18 and perfectly capable of making your own decisions about communication. Eleanor's eyes twinkled slightly. I may have also mentioned that had she been more attentive to her maternal responsibilities over the past 4 years, the current situation might be different. I winced, imagining Mom's reaction to that pointed remark. And Vanessa? Vanessa cycling through threats, tears, and bargaining in the span of a 3-minute conversation. Quite the emotional roller coaster. Eleanor dismissed Vanessa's reaction with a wave of her hand. But enough about them. We have important matters to discuss today. She indicated the folders beside her. These contain information about the Mitchell holdings you'll eventually manage, property deeds, investment portfolios, charitable foundation documents. We'll go through them systematically over the coming weeks. Today, however, I want to address more immediate practical concerns. For the next hour, Eleanor outlined a plan for my transition, arrangements to retrieve my belongings from Richard's house, with Bryant and security personnel present to prevent confrontation, enrollment in online courses about estate management, and financial literacy to supplement our personal tutoring sessions, and the legal steps necessary to establish me as her official heir and successor. Edward Harrington will be here this afternoon to begin the paperwork, she explained. There are trust documents to sign, powers of attorney to establish, and various legal protections to put in place. Richard will be looking for vulnerabilities. We're going to ensure he doesn't find any. The scope of what lay ahead was both exciting and intimidating. I'd known the Mitchell fortune was substantial, but the details Eleanor shared revealed its true magnitude. Hundreds of millions in assets spanning real estate, art collections, investment portfolios, and business holdings across multiple states and countries. It's overwhelming, I admitted. A week ago, I was worried about college tuition. Now I'm discussing managing a multi-million-dollar estate. You'll learn, Eleanor assured me. I didn't understand any of this when I married Harrison Mitchell either. The difference is your willingness to learn, to take responsibility seriously, rather than seeing wealth as merely a means to status and luxury. Her confidence in me was both touching and terrifying. What if I disappointed her? What if I couldn't live up to the enormous responsibility she was placing on my shoulders? As if reading my thoughts, Eleanor reached across and squeezed my hand gently. Cassandra, I'm not expecting perfection. I'm expecting effort, integrity, and growth. That's all anyone can ask. Our conversation was interrupted by Margaret appearing at the library door, her expression troubled. Mrs. Mitchell, I apologize for the interruption, but Mrs. Alexandra, Mitchell is at the gate. She's insisting on seeing Cassandra immediately. Bryant has asked for instructions. Eleanor looked to me, her expression making it clear that this was my decision to make. My stomach tightened at the thought of facing Mom so soon after yesterday's revelations. What could she possibly say that would undo years of gradual erasure, culminating in her asking Eleanor to cut me out of the will entirely? But hiding wouldn't solve anything. Eventually, I would have to face her. It's okay, I told Eleanor. I'll see her. Eleanor studied my face. Are you certain? There's no obligation. I'm sure, I said, more confidently than I felt. Better to get it over with. Eleanor nodded to Margaret. Please tell Bryant to escort Mrs. Mitchell to the garden room. We'll meet her there shortly. As Margaret left, Eleanor turned back to me. The garden room has excellent acoustics and multiple exits. If the conversation becomes too difficult, you can easily leave. The strategic consideration behind this simple room choice reinforced how seriously Eleanor took my well-being. It was a stark contrast to the Mitchell household, where my comfort had never been a priority. "Would you like me to accompany you?" Eleanor asked. I considered for a moment. "No, I think I need to do this alone. But maybe nearby?" "I'll be in my study right next door," she promised. "Just call if you need me." The garden room was a bright, airy space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Eleanor's winter garden. Even in the cold months, the structured landscaping created a beautiful view of carefully pruned shapes and winter-flowering plants. The room itself was comfortable without being overly formal, a space designed for actual relaxation rather than impressing visitors. Mom was standing by the windows when I entered, her back to the door. She wore one of her carefully selected casual outfits, designer jeans, cashmere sweater, and subtle jewelry that probably cost more than a semester of college tuition. Her blonde hair, dyed to match Vanessa's natural shade, was perfectly styled as always. She turned at the sound of the door, and I was surprised to see that her usually flawless makeup couldn't completely hide the evidence of a sleepless night. Her eyes were slightly puffy, her complexion less radiant than usual. "Cassandra," she said, taking a step toward me before stopping herself, uncertain of her welcome. "Thank you for seeing me." "You didn't leave me much choice by showing up unannounced," I replied, keeping my voice neutral as I took a seat in one of the comfortable armchairs. I didn't invite her to sit, but she did anyway, perching on the edge of the chair opposite mine. "I had to come," she said. "After yesterday, we need to talk." "About what, exactly? About how you asked Grandma Eleanor to cut me out of her will entirely? About how you've been systematically erasing me from the family for years? Or about how you edited me out of the Christmas photo?" Mom flinched visibly at each accusation. "You don't understand," she began. "The Mitchell family has expectations, traditions." "I'm not talking about the Mitchells," I interrupted. "I'm talking about you, Mom. My mother. The person who's supposed to love me and protect me no matter what." Her eyes filled with tears. "I do love you, Cassandra. Everything I've done has been for your benefit, even if you can't see that." "For my benefit?" I repeated incredulously. "How exactly does erasing me from family photos benefit me?" "You don't understand the pressure," she insisted. "Richard's world has certain standards, expectations. I was trying to help you fit in, to belong." "No," I cut her off firmly. "You were trying to make yourself belong, even if it meant sacrificing me in the process. Let's be honest for once, Mom. You chose status over your own daughter." A tear slipped down her cheek, leaving a track in her carefully applied makeup. "It wasn't like that. I wanted security for both of us. When your father died, we had nothing. Do you remember how hard those years were? The double shifts, the constant worry about bills, the tiny apartment. I remember a mother who read me bedtime stories no matter how tired she was," I replied quietly. "I remember being loved unconditionally. I remember feeling like I belonged." Mom looked away, unable to meet my eyes. "When I met Richard, it seemed like a miracle, a chance to give us both a better life. But it wasn't better for me, was it? Not when better meant being constantly compared to Vanessa, being pushed aside, being treated like an embarrassing reminder of your past life." "Cassandra, please," she pleaded. "You have to understand the position I'm in now. This inheritance situation is impossible. Richard is furious. Vanessa is devastated. Our standing in the community—" "There it is," I interrupted, disappointment washing over me. "Your real concern. Not me, not our relationship, but your social standing." "That's not fair," she protested weakly. "Isn't it? You haven't asked how I'm feeling once since you arrived. You haven't apologized for asking Eleanor to disinherit me. You haven't even acknowledged editing me out of that photo." I leaned forward, forcing her to meet my gaze. Tell me honestly. Mom, if Eleanor had agreed to cut me out of her will, would you have ever told me? Or would you have just continued pretending to support me while secretly undermining my future? Her silence was all the answer I needed. Why are you really here? I asked after a moment. What do you want from me? She straightened slightly, composing herself. We both think that there must be a compromise available. Eleanor has always been dramatic about family matters. If you spoke to her, explained that this inheritance plan is causing unnecessary division. I laughed, a sharp sound without humor. So that's it? You want me to turn down my inheritance so Vanessa can have it? So you can maintain your perfect Mitchell fantasy? It's not about the money, Mom insisted. It's about family harmony, about what's best for everyone. Everyone except me, I noted. Tell me, when have Richard or Vanessa ever considered what was best for me? When have you? In the past 4 years? She had no answer for that. I'm staying here with Grandma Eleanor, I said firmly. I'm accepting the responsibility she's entrusting to me, and I'm finally putting myself first, since no one else in that house ever did. Mom's expression hardened slightly, her tears drying, up as she recognized the futility of emotional manipulation. You don't understand what you're doing, Cassandra. Richard won't accept this. There will be consequences. Are you threatening me, Mom? On his behalf? I'm warning you, she corrected. The Mitchell family has influence in ways you can't imagine. College admissions, future employment, social circles. Richard can make things very difficult. The naked threat shocked me, even though Eleanor had predicted exactly this strategy. So that's where we are? You're delivering threats for your husband against your own daughter? For a brief moment, something like shame flickered across her face before the polished Alexis Mitchell mask slid back into place. I'm trying to help you understand the reality of the situation. This isn't a fairy tale where you get to walk away with millions while everyone smiles and wishes you well. There are real-world consequences to challenging a family like the Mitchells. I stood up, suddenly tired of the conversation. I think we're done here. You've made your position perfectly clear, and I've made mine. Cassandra, please. I'll send Bryant to collect my things from the house tomorrow. Please make sure someone is there to let him in. She stood as well, desperation creeping back into her expression. You can't just cut me out of your life. I'm your mother. The irony of her statement was so profound that I could only stare at her in disbelief. That's exactly what you've been doing to me for years, Mom. Cutting me out. Inch by inch. Photo by photo. Choice by choice. That's not true, she protested weakly. Isn't it? When was the last time you asked about my dreams, my hopes? When was the last time you defended me when Richard or Vanessa made one of their cutting remarks? When was the last time you chose me? She had no answer. I'll always be your daughter, I said more gently. But right now I need space from you and the Mitchells. Maybe in time we can rebuild something, but it won't be on Richard's terms or with Vanessa's conditions. It will be honest or not at all. Before she could respond, I walked out of the garden room, pulling the door firmly closed behind me. My hands were trembling, but my resolve was steady. Eleanor was waiting in the hallway, her expression concerned. Are you all right? She asked softly. No, I admitted. But I will be. She nodded understanding. Bryant will escort her out when she's ready. In the meantime, I believe Edward Harrington has arrived early for our appointment. Perhaps focusing on practical matters would be helpful right now? The distraction of legal paperwork was exactly what I needed. Something concrete and forward-looking to pull me away from the emotional morass of my conversation with Mom. Mr. Harrington was efficient and thorough, explaining each document in clear terms before I signed. By late afternoon, the initial legal framework was in place. I had been formally designated as Eleanor's heir and successor, with carefully structured trusts, powers of attorney, and financial protections established. The paperwork couldn't prevent Richard from challenging the will after Eleanor's death, but it created significant legal obstacles to any such challenge. "Miss Hayes, I want you to understand something important," Mr. Harrington said as we concluded our business. "Mrs. Mitchell's decision isn't merely a personal preference. It's a considered judgment based on her assessment of character and capability. In the 30 years I've known Eleanor Mitchell, I've never seen her make a significant decision without thorough deliberation." His words were clearly meant to reassure me, to reinforce that I wasn't simply the beneficiary of an elderly woman's whim or an instrument of her revenge against her son. Eleanor had chosen me because she genuinely believed in me. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington," I said, feeling the weight of both the responsibility and the vote of confidence. After the lawyer departed, Eleanor suggested a walk in the gardens to clear our minds. Despite the January chill, the grounds were beautiful, with winter-flowering shrubs adding unexpected color to the structured landscape. "Your mother has left," Eleanor informed me as we strolled along the gravel paths. "Bryant said she seemed subdued." "She threatened me," I said, still processing. The conversation, or rather delivered Richard's threats. "Apparently he can ruin my college prospects, future employment, and social standing," Eleanor scoffed. "Richard overestimates his influence as always. Besides, we've anticipated this. The applications you've already submitted are beyond his reach, and with the Mitchell resources behind you, his attempts at sabotage will be easily countered." She paused to examine a winter jasmine's yellow blooms. "Did Alexandra attempt to persuade you to decline the inheritance?" "Of course," I confirmed. "She called it a compromise for family harmony." "She never once acknowledged how they've treated me or apologized for asking you to cut me out." Eleanor sighed. "Alexandra was so much stronger before Richard. I remember meeting her at that charity gala. She was confident, intelligent, ambitious in the best way. I actually encouraged Richard to pursue her, believing she might bring some backbone into his life." She shook her head sadly. "Instead, he systematically stripped away everything substantial about her, until all that remained was this polished, empty shell obsessed with appearances." The description was painfully accurate. The mom I remembered from childhood, the nurse, who worked double shifts, who stood up to bill collectors, who made me believe I could accomplish anything, had vanished into Alexis Mitchell's society wife. "I don't think I can forgive her," I admitted, the realization bringing both pain and clarity. "Not yet, anyway." "Forgiveness isn't an obligation, Cassandra. It's a choice that can only be made when genuine remorse is shown." Eleanor's expression was gentle, but firm. "Alexandra hasn't earned forgiveness yet. Perhaps someday she will, but that's for her to demonstrate, and for you to decide." As we completed our circuit of the garden and headed back toward the house, I found myself thinking about the sealed letter about my father still waiting in my room. After confronting one parental reality today, perhaps it was time to face another. "Grandma Eleanor," I said tentatively, "the letter about my father, I think I'm ready to read it now." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "After dinner, then. Take your time with it. I'll be available if you have questions afterward." Dinner was a quiet affair. Just Eleanor and me in the smaller dining room, rather than the formal space used for yesterday's disastrous family lunch. The food was excellent, but simple. The conversation light and undemanding. Eleanor seemed to understand intuitively that I needed emotional space after the day's confrontations. After we finished eating, she squeezed my hand gently. "Remember, Cassandra, whatever you discover in that letter doesn't define you. You've built your own identity, your own character, regardless of your parentage." In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, turning the sealed envelope over in my hands. What truths lay inside? What surprises? For a moment, I considered simply putting it away again. After all, I'd lived 18 years without knowing anything substantial about my father. Did I really need to add more complications to an already tumultuous time? But ultimately, curiosity and the desire for truth won out. I broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. Cassandra, if you're reading this, I've shared my decision about the Mitchell inheritance with you, and you've chosen to remain at my side despite the inevitable family backlash. I'm not surprised. You've demonstrated remarkable strength of character. These past 4 years, what follows is information about your father that I've gathered through discreet investigation. Your mother may or may not be aware of all these details. I suspect she knows more than she's shared with you, but less than the full truth. Your father's name was Daniel Hayes, as you know. What you likely don't know is that he didn't die when you were an infant, as Alexandra has claimed. In fact, he may still be alive, though I haven't been able to confirm this with absolute certainty. I gasped, the letter trembling in my hands. My father might be alive? The foundation of what I thought I knew about my own history cracked beneath me. Daniel Hayes was a promising young surgeon when he met your mother during her nursing rotation at Boston Memorial Hospital. Their relationship was intense, but brief. When Alexandra discovered she was pregnant, Daniel was completing a prestigious fellowship that would take him to a humanitarian medical mission in Africa for 2 years. According to my sources, Alexandra told Daniel about the pregnancy, but insisted she could manage on her own, rather than disrupting his career opportunity. She rejected his offer to marry her and stay in Boston. Whether this was genuine selflessness or pride, I cannot say. Daniel departed for Africa, maintaining contact through letters and occasional phone calls during your first year. Then, abruptly, all communication ceased. The medical mission confirmed that Daniel had left their program suddenly, citing a family emergency, but they had no forwarding information. Alexandra apparently made efforts to locate him initially, but eventually told everyone, including you, that he had died. Whether she truly believed this or found it a convenient explanation, I cannot determine with certainty. My investigators tracked Daniel's movements to London, then to several medical relief organizations in Southeast Asia over the years. The most recent information places him at a rural hospital in northern Thailand as of 2 years ago, but the trail goes cold after that. I've included all the documentation my investigators gathered in the accompanying folder, his last known, addresses, photographs, including one of him holding you as an infant that Alexandra may not know exists, and contact information for people who knew him. What you do with this information is entirely your choice, Cassandra. You may wish to conduct your own search, or you may decide that the past should remain past. Either way, I believed you deserved to know the truth as best as I could discover it. With love and respect, Eleanor Mitchell. I sat stunned, the letter, limp in my hands, my mind struggling to process this new reality. My father, possibly alive somewhere in the world, not the conveniently dead figure from Mom's simplified narrative. With shaking hands, I reached for the accompanying folder Eleanor had mentioned in her letter. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings about a promising young surgeon receiving a prestigious humanitarian fellowship, photocopies of hospital staff directories from Boston Memorial, and most jarringly, photographs of a man I'd never seen before, yet whose eyes were undeniably like my own. One photo in particular made my breath catch. A younger version of my mother, looking happier than I'd seen her in years, standing beside a tall, serious-looking man with my same dark hair and angular features. Between them, held awkwardly but tenderly in the man's arms, was an infant wrapped in a pink blanket. Me. The evidence of my father's existence, and the possibility that he might still be alive somewhere, was overwhelming. All my life, the story had been simple. Daniel Hayes, brilliant young doctor, tragic early death, end of story. Mom had always deflected my questions with vague responses about it being too painful to discuss, until eventually I'd stopped asking. But here was proof that my father had held me, had known me, if only briefly, and had possibly left not because of death, but for reasons unknown. A soft knock at the door pulled me from my spiral of thoughts. "Cassandra?" Eleanor's voice called gently. "May I come in?" I quickly gathered the documents, sliding them back into the folder before calling, "Yes, come in." Eleanor entered, her keen eyes immediately noting my dazed expression. "You've read it, then?" "He might be alive," I said, the words still feeling foreign on my tongue. All these years, Mom said he was dead, but he might be alive somewhere in Thailand or anywhere. Eleanor nodded, settling carefully into the armchair by the window. That was my investigator's best information, though it's 2 years old now. The humanitarian medical community is remarkably mobile and often operates in areas with limited communication infrastructure. Why would she lie about something so fundamental? I asked, the hurt of this new betrayal sharp and fresh. Why tell me he was dead if he wasn't? "People lie for many reasons," Eleanor replied thoughtfully. "Sometimes to protect others, sometimes to protect themselves. Alexandra may have found it easier to explain his absence with death rather than abandonment. Though whether he truly abandoned you is unclear from the evidence." I stared down at the folder in my lap. There's a photo of him holding me. I've never seen his face before today. Not once in 18 years. That photo came from one of his former colleagues at Boston Memorial, Eleanor explained. Alexandra may not even know it exists. The thought that Mom might have deliberately kept images of my father from me was almost too painful to contemplate. Had she erased him from our history the same way she'd later edit me out of photos? What should I do with this information? I asked, feeling lost in the magnitude of the revelation. "That's entirely your decision," Eleanor said gently. "You could attempt to locate him, though it might be a difficult search. You could confront Alexandra with what you now know, or you could simply hold this truth for yourself until you decide what, if anything, to do with it." I considered each option. Searching for a man who might not want to be found, who might have deliberately vanished from my life, felt like inviting more heartbreak. Confronting Mom now, in the midst of the inheritance conflict, would only add fuel to an already volatile situation. "I think I need time," I said finally, "to process this before I decide what to do." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "A wise approach. There's no deadline on truth, Cassandra. Take all the time you need." That night, sleep eluded me again, but for entirely different reasons. The face from the photographs, my father's face, haunted my thoughts. I had his eyes, his jawline, even the slight furrow between the brows when concentrating. For years, I'd had no reference point for these features, no understanding of where they came from. Now I knew. By morning, I'd reached a decision about at least one aspect of this new complication. I would keep the information about my father private for now. With Richard and Mom already mobilizing against me over the inheritance, adding another emotional grenade to the situation seemed unwise. The next few days settled into a surreal new normal. Bryant and security staff successfully retrieved my belongings from the Mitchell house, a process that went smoothly only because Mom and Vanessa had deliberately been away during the scheduled time. My modest possessions looked almost comically out of place in the grand blue suite, but Eleanor encouraged me to make the space truly mine, suggesting we shop for additional items I might need or want. "The Mitchell fortune doesn't require you to change who you are," she insisted, when I expressed discomfort at the idea of spending substantial money on my bedroom. "It simply gives you freedom to express yourself authentically without financial constraints." Meanwhile, the legal and financial education Eleanor had planned for me began in earnest. Each morning included several hours with either Eleanor herself or one of the trusted advisors she'd selected to teach me about various aspects of wealth management, philanthropy, and estate administration. The afternoons were typically reserved for more personal pursuits, continuing my college application process, now with the freedom to consider any university without financial limitations, exploring the extensive grounds of the estate, and spending time with Eleanor discussing everything from classic literature to current world events. The rhythm of life at Eleanor's estate was so different from the Mitchell household. There, appearances and social positioning dominated every decision. Here, substance and genuine interests took precedence. I found myself beginning to relax, to rediscover aspects of myself that had been suppressed during my years trying to fit into Richard and Mom's world. A week after my confrontation with Mom, Eleanor received word that Richard had indeed consulted with several high-profile attorneys about challenging her will and succession plan. As expected, she remarked calmly, over breakfast, reviewing the information her sources had provided. He's discovering exactly what Edward told us. The legal protections are formidable, and challenging them would likely cost him his own inheritance. Will that stop him? I asked, still learning to navigate this world of legal maneuvers and strategic family conflict. Eventually, Eleanor predicted. Richard has always been risk-averse when it comes to his own financial security. He'll bluster and threaten, but ultimately, he won't sacrifice millions in guaranteed inheritance on a legal gamble he's likely to lose. She was proven right 3 days later when Mr. Harrington informed us that Richard had shifted strategies. He's now attempting to negotiate, the lawyer reported during his weekly visit. He's proposed that in exchange for Cassandra voluntarily declining the main estate and controlling interest in the family holdings, he'll establish a substantial trust fund for her and guarantee Vanessa will respect her position as a valued family member. I couldn't help but laugh at the transparent attempt at manipulation. A valued family member? After years of treating me like an inconvenient house guest? That's rich. Indeed, Eleanor agreed dryly. Edward, please inform Richard that his proposal is declined. Cassandra stands by our original arrangement. As January gave way to February, the direct attacks from the Mitchell side of the family slowly transformed into a more insidious social campaign. Through Eleanor's connections, we learned that Richard and Mom were systematically spreading a narrative about me throughout their social circles, portraying me as an ungrateful, manipulative girl who had taken advantage of an elderly woman's confusion and declining health to secure an inheritance I didn't deserve. They're trying to isolate you socially, Eleanor explained when I expressed hurt at hearing these rumors. It's a classic tactic when direct confrontation fails. They hope that if enough people believe their narrative, you'll feel pressured to concede. Their strategy might have worked had I been deeply embedded in Mitchell social circles, but my closest friendships, particularly with Zoe, existed outside that world. When I told Zoe the full story during one of her visits to the estate, her reaction was exactly what I needed. "Are you kidding me?" she exclaimed, practically vibrating with indignation. "Your mom actually asked Eleanor to cut you out of the will entirely, and then has the nerve to paint you as the manipulative one? That's some next-level gaslighting." Her unwavering support was a balm to my spirits. "The worst part is, some people are actually believing their version," I told her. "The Winters family apparently uninvited me from their daughter's graduation party because they don't want to take sides in a family dispute." Zoe rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh no, you can't attend Madison Winters' boring party where everyone stands around in designer clothes pretending to like each other. Such a loss." Her sarcasm made me laugh despite everything. "Besides," she added more seriously, "the people who matter know the truth." Meanwhile, college acceptance letters began arriving. I'd been accepted to several prestigious universities across the country, including 2 that had been my reach. Schools before Eleanor's inheritance changed my financial reality. The freedom to choose based purely on academic and personal fit rather than affordability was exhilarating. Eleanor was particularly pleased when I received an acceptance from Harrison University, an elite institution known for its literature and history programs. "Your grandfather, Richard's father, graduated from Harrison," she told me. "He would be delighted to know you're considering it." February also brought a significant health scare for Eleanor. I found her one morning in the library, struggling to breathe. her usually pale complexion alarmingly gray. The next few hours were a terrifying blur of ambulances, emergency rooms, and anxious waiting while doctors worked to stabilize her heart condition. "Just a warning shot across the bow," she joked weakly from her hospital bed later that day, trying to minimize my concern. "This old ticker still has plenty of fight left." Despite her optimism, the doctors were more cautious in their assessment. The episode had been serious, a severe arrhythmia that indicated her heart condition was progressing. They adjusted her medications and recommended reducing stress, but the underlying message was clear. Eleanor's health was more precarious than she'd been admitting. As she recovered at home over the following week, I found our roles subtly reversing. I began taking on more responsibilities around the estate, sitting in on business meetings Eleanor would normally have handled personally, and ensuring she actually followed the doctor's orders for rest and stress reduction. "You see," she remarked, one afternoon as I reviewed investment reports with her, making notes on decisions that needed her attention, "this is exactly why you're the right choice. A crisis arises, and instead of panicking, you step up." The health scare seemed to accelerate Eleanor's determination to ensure I was fully prepared for the responsibilities ahead. Our educational sessions intensified, with Eleanor insisting on covering topics we might otherwise have spread over months. "Just being thorough," she would say whenever I expressed concern about her pushing herself too hard. "There's no such thing as being over-prepared for the stewardship of significant wealth." March arrived with unexpected developments from the Mitchell camp. Vanessa, apparently tiring of her parents' ineffective strategies, decided to take matters into her own hands. She showed up at Eleanor's estate unannounced one afternoon while Eleanor was resting and I was working in the library. Margaret appeared at the library door, clearly uncomfortable. "Miss Vanessa Mitchell is here demanding to see you, Cassandra." Bryant asked if he should turn her away, but she's quite insistent. The thought of facing Vanessa alone was daunting, but continuing to avoid direct confrontation wouldn't solve anything. "It's all right, Margaret. I'll see her in the garden room." Vanessa had changed since our last encounter at the disastrous family lunch in January. Her usually perfect appearance showed subtle signs of strain, slightly dark circles under her eyes, a tension in her posture that hadn't been there before. She wore expensive designer clothes as always, but there was something performative about it now, as if she was trying too hard to project the confidence she'd once taken for granted. "Well, you've certainly landed on your feet," she said by way of greeting, her gaze sweeping critically around the garden room. "Moved right in and made yourself at home in what should have been my inheritance." I remained standing, unwilling, to invite her to sit. "What do you want, Vanessa? I doubt you came all this way for small talk." "Straight to business? Fine." She crossed her arms. "I want to understand why you're doing this. Is it revenge for how we treated you? Is it about the money? What's your endgame here?" The question actually surprised me with its directness. "I'm not doing anything, Vanessa. Grandma Eleanor made her decision. I didn't ask for this inheritance or manipulate her into giving it to me." "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You've been playing the perfect granddaughter for years with your little book discussions and demure act. Don't pretend you haven't been working toward this all along." I sighed, suddenly tired of the Mitchell family's inability to conceive of motivations beyond manipulation and status seeking. "Believe what you want, Vanessa. It doesn't change the reality of the situation." "Do you have any idea what you've done to our family?" she demanded, her voice rising slightly. "Dad is obsessed with finding ways to challenge the will. Alexis barely leaves her room some days. Our standing in the community is compromised because people are taking sides. All because you couldn't just accept your place and be grateful for what we gave you." The sheer audacity of her perspective was almost impressive. In Vanessa's world, my acceptance of Eleanor's decision was the betrayal, not their years of systematic exclusion and dismissal. "My place?" I repeated, meeting her, gazed steadily. You mean the place where I was edited out of family photos? Where I was given cheap keychains while you got Chanel? Where my mother pretended I didn't exist whenever it was socially convenient? Vanessa had the grace to look momentarily discomfited at the specific examples, but quickly rallied. You were never going to be a real Mitchell, Cassandra. You don't have the background, the connections, the social understanding. Grandma Eleanor has set you up to fail spectacularly, and everyone is going to watch it happen. If that's what you believe, then why are you here? I asked. If I'm destined to fail, wouldn't it be more satisfying to simply watch from a distance? She hesitated, something vulnerable flickering briefly across her face before the Mitchell mask slipped back into place. I'm here to offer you one last chance to do the right thing. Step aside voluntarily, decline the main inheritance. Dad will ensure you're provided for generously, enough to attend any college, buy a nice home, live comfortably. But the Mitchell estate and business interests come back to the family where they belong. For a moment, I allowed myself to consider her offer. It would certainly be easier. The path of least resistance, avoiding years of Mitchell resentment and possible sabotage, but it would also mean betraying Eleanor's faith in me and, perhaps more importantly, betraying myself. I can't do that, Vanessa, I said finally. Not because I want the money or because I'm trying to hurt your family, but because Eleanor believes I'm the right person to carry forward her vision for the Mitchell legacy. I won't disrespect that trust. Vanessa's expression hardened. Then you've made your choice. Don't expect any reconciliation from our side. As far as the Mitchell family is concerned, you no longer exist. The irony of her statement, threatening me with the very erasure they'd been practicing for years, almost made me laugh. That's nothing new, Vanessa. You've been trying to erase me since the day we met. She turned to leave, pausing at the door. You think you've won, but you have no idea what's coming. Dad has connections you can't imagine. This isn't over, not by a long shot. After she left, I remained in the garden room, processing the encounter. Despite Vanessa's dramatic exit and ominous threats, something about our interaction had felt different from previous Mitchell confrontations. There had been a moment, brief but unmistakable, when Vanessa's carefully constructed facade had slipped, revealing something more complex than simple entitlement and resentment. When I related the conversation to Eleanor later, she listened thoughtfully. Interesting that Vanessa came alone, without Richard or Alexandra. Perhaps she's beginning to think independently, even if her conclusions remain predictably Mitchell-esque. She threatened that Richard has connections I can't imagine, I reported. Should we be worried? Eleanor smiled slightly. Richard's connections are primarily other wealthy men exactly like himself, impressed by status, easily influenced by flattery, and utterly dependent on their money to maintain their position. They may cause some social inconvenience, but they pose no real threat to your future. As winter slowly yielded to spring, life at the estate settled into a productive rhythm. My education in Mitchell business matters progressed rapidly, with Eleanor pronouncing herself impressed by how quickly I absorbed complex financial concepts. College decisions were finalized. I'd chosen Harrison University for its exceptional humanities programs and would start in the fall. The Mitchell family maintained their social campaign against me, but had ceased direct confront. The Mitchell family maintained their social campaign against me, but had ceased direct confrontations, seeming to realize they were ineffective against Eleanor's iron will and careful legal preparations. April brought another health crisis for Eleanor, more severe than the February episode. This time, she was hospitalized for nearly a week, with doctors speaking in increasingly grave terms about her prognosis. I barely left her side, sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair, advocating with medical staff, and continuing to manage estate matters from my laptop during the quiet hours when Eleanor slept. You shouldn't be spending your days in this dreary hospital room, Eleanor protested weakly one afternoon, her usually commanding voice diminished by illness and medication. "You're young. You should be out living your life, not watching an old woman's decline." "I'm exactly where I want to be," I assured her, squeezing her frail hand gently. "Besides, you're not declining. You're just taking a brief intermission before your triumphant return to terrorizing the board of the Mitchell Foundation." That made her smile, a flash of her usual spirit lighting her pale face. "Cheeky girl, but you're right. I'm not done making trouble yet." Despite her determination, Eleanor's body was clearly failing her. When she finally returned home, it was with an increased medication regimen, a part-time nurse, and strict limitations on her activities. The vibrant, commanding presence that had intimidated Richard and charmed me was diminishing, though her mind remained as sharp as ever. I took on more responsibilities, both in caring for Eleanor and managing the Mitchell business interests under her guidance. Some days were better than others, moments when Eleanor seemed almost her old self, engaged and energetic, followed by days when simply moving from her bed to a chair in the library exhausted her. Throughout it all, she remained focused on preparing me, using even her worst days to impart final lessons about wealth, responsibility, and the Mitchell legacy as she understood it. "The money itself is meaningless," she told me during one of our quiet afternoon conversations in her bedroom suite. "It's merely a tool. What matters is how you use it to shape the world around you." May arrived with a surprising development. Margaret entered the library where I was reviewing Mitchell Foundation grant proposals to inform me that my mother was at the gate, requesting to see me, alone, without Richard or Vanessa. "Did she say what it was about?" I asked, wariness and curiosity battling within me. I hadn't spoken to Mom since our confrontation in February. "No, but she seems different," Margaret replied thoughtfully. "Less polished, if that makes sense." After checking that Eleanor was resting comfortably, I agreed to see Mom in the garden room, our usual meeting place for difficult conversations. When she entered, I was startled by her appearance. Gone was the immaculately groomed Alexis Mitchell, society wife. Instead, she looked almost like the mom I remembered from before Richard. Her hair, its natural light brown, instead of the blonde she'd maintained for years. Her clothing simple and unbranded, her face free of the heavy makeup she'd adopted as part of her Mitchell persona. "Cassandra," she said softly, stopping just inside the doorway. "Thank you for seeing me." "You look different," I observed, gesturing for her to take a seat. She touched her hair self-consciously. "I stopped coloring it, among other changes." I waited, curious about the purpose of this unexpected visit, but unwilling to make it easy for her by asking. "How is Eleanor?" she asked after an awkward silence. "Declining," I answered honestly. "Her heart is failing, though her mind is still perfectly sharp. The doctors say it could be weeks or months." Mom nodded, her expression somber. "I'm sorry to hear that. Despite our differences, I've always respected her strength." Another silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken words and years of growing distance. Finally, Mom took a deep breath. "I've left Richard," she said simply. Whatever I'd been expecting, it wasn't this. "You what?" "I moved out last week. I'm staying in a small apartment near my old hospital. I've applied to renew my nursing license." The words tumbled out in a rush, as if she'd been rehearsing them but still feared losing her nerve. "I don't understand," I said slowly. "After everything you did to become Alexis Mitchell, you're just walking away?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I lost myself, Cassandra. Somewhere between Alexandra Hayes and Alexis Mitchell, I lost who I truly was. And worse," her voice broke, "I lost you." I felt my chest tighten with conflicting emotions, skepticism, hope, lingering hurt. Why now? Is this because of the inheritance? Because if you think this will somehow change Eleanor's decision, no, she interrupted firmly. This isn't about the money. It's about finally seeing clearly what I've become. She wiped away a tear. The day you left, when I delivered Richard's threats to my own daughter, something broke inside me. I couldn't recognize myself anymore. I remained silent, processing her words, searching for signs of manipulation or hidden agendas. I don't expect you to forgive me, she continued. I wouldn't, in your position. I just wanted you to know that I see now what I did to you. How I erased you, bit by bit, to make room for the life I thought I wanted. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I was wrong, Cassandra, so terribly wrong. Does Richard know you're here? I asked, still cautious. She shook her head. He doesn't know I'm seeing you. He's furious about my leaving, threatened to cut me off financially, to ruin me socially, as if those things matter anymore. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. I told him I survived before him, and I'll survive after him. Something in her words, in the quiet dignity with which she spoke of starting over, reminded me of the mother I'd known before. The one who had faced financial hardship with determination rather than shame. Who had taught me that our worth wasn't measured by our possessions or status. I have something for you, she said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a small photo album. I saved these, even when Richard wanted all evidence of our before life removed from the house. I accepted the album cautiously. Opening it, I found photographs I hadn't seen in years. Mom and me in our old apartment, celebrating birthdays with homemade cakes. The two of us at the beach during a rare day off from her nursing shifts. A young me in my school play costume while Mom beamed proudly beside me. Why are you giving me these now? I asked, my voice thick with unexpected emotion. Because they're real, she said simply. Not posed, not edited, not performed for someone else's approval. Just us as we were. She hesitated. And because I want you to know that woman in those photos, your mother, still exists. Underneath all the mistakes and wrong choices. I closed the album carefully, placing it on the table between us. I don't know what to say, Mom. A lot has happened. I can't just forget. I'm not asking you to forget, she interrupted gently. Or to forgive, at least not yet. I'm just asking for a chance, someday, to try to rebuild something real between us. She stood, gathering her purse. I should go. I've taken enough of your time, and I'm sure Eleanor needs you. As she turned to leave, a question that had been burning inside me for months suddenly demanded to be asked. Mom, wait. I need to know something. Why did you tell me my father was dead when he wasn't? She froze, her back to me, shoulders tensing visibly. After a long moment, she turned slowly to face me. How did you... She stopped herself. Eleanor's investigations, of course. Is it true? I pressed. Is Daniel Hayes still alive somewhere? Mom sank back into her chair, looking suddenly exhausted. I don't know, she admitted. He was alive the last time I had any contact with him, but that was years ago. Why did you lie to me? My whole life you told me he died when I was a baby. Because the truth was more complicated and eventually more painful. She stared down at her hands. Daniel did leave for that medical mission in Africa, as Eleanor discovered. He wrote regularly at first, called when he could. He was trying in his way to be a father from a distance. She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. Then his letters started changing. He wrote about the devastating conditions he was witnessing, the children dying from preventable diseases, the profound needs of the communities he was serving. He felt called to stay, to extend his mission. So he chose his work over us, I said, a dull ache spreading in my chest. It wasn't that simple, Mom replied. He wanted us to join him, to bring you to Africa, then later to Thailand and other places where he was working. He believed his purpose was to serve those communities, and he wanted us to be part of that purpose. I frowned, trying to understand. But you didn't want to go? Cassandra, he was talking about taking a baby. You, to areas with limited medical facilities, unstable governments, sometimes even conflict zones. Places where you might contract diseases for which you had no immunity, where proper education would be nearly impossible to obtain. Her voice strengthened with the conviction of a mother protecting her child. I couldn't risk your health and future that way, no matter how noble his cause. The complexity of this narrative was difficult to absorb. Not a simple abandonment, but a fundamental disagreement about what kind of life we should lead. We argued about it for months, through letters and rare phone calls. Mom continued. Eventually, he stopped responding. I tried to find him, but he'd moved on from the original mission to another organization in another country. After a year of silence, it seemed simpler, cleaner, to tell you he had died. A dead father is easier to explain to a child than one who chooses a different life. Over his family. You should have told me the truth when I was old enough to understand, I said, unable to keep the accusation from my voice. You're right, she acknowledged without defensiveness. That was another mistake in a long series of them. By then, I had convinced myself that the lie was kinder than the truth. She looked at me with profound regret. I thought I was protecting you, but I was really protecting myself from difficult questions and painful memories. I considered her words, searching for signs of the manipulative Alexis Mitchell I'd come to distrust, but finding only Alexandra. Hayes, flawed, human, but fundamentally honest in this moment. I have his letters, she added quietly. All of them, including the last ones where he was begging us to join him. I've kept them all these years. They're yours if you want them. The offer surprised me. You'd give them to me? Even though they show a different story than the one you've told? Yes, she said simply, because you deserve the truth, however complicated or unflattering to me it might be. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of these revelations settling between us. Finally, I spoke. I can't promise anything, Mom. Too much has happened, but maybe we can start with coffee sometime, just to talk. The hope that bloomed on her face was genuine and heartbreaking. I'd like that very much, she said softly. After she left, I sat alone in the garden room for a long time, processing everything she'd shared. The photos, the revelation about my father, her leaving Richard. It was too much to absorb at once. Part of me remained wary, concerned this might be an elaborate strategy to manipulate me regarding the inheritance. But the Alexandra I'd glimpsed today seemed so far removed from the Alexis who had delivered Richard's threats months ago. When I finally returned to Eleanor's room to check on her, I found her awake and alert, watching me with knowing eyes. Alexandra. Came to see you, she said. It wasn't a question. Margaret told you? Eleanor smiled faintly. Margaret tells me everything. It's part of our arrangement. How was the visit? I settled into the chair beside her bed, suddenly exhausted. Confusing. She says she's left Richard, that she's trying to restart her nursing career. She brought me old photos of us from before everything changed. And you're wondering if it's genuine or another Mitchell manipulation? Eleanor observed shrewdly. Exactly. I sighed. She seemed different, more like the mom I remember from childhood. But after years of watching her become someone else entirely, it's hard to trust this sudden transformation. Eleanor considered this thoughtfully. People can change, Cassandra. Not often, and rarely without significant catalyst, but it does happen. The question is whether Alexandra has truly recognized her mistakes or is simply adapting to new circumstances. She told me about my father, I added. Her version mostly matches what your investigators found, though with more personal details. She offered me his letters. That's significant, Eleanor remarked. Offering you direct evidence that might contradict her narrative suggests a genuine desire for transparency. I nodded slowly. I told her maybe we could have coffee sometime. Just to talk. Is that naive of me? Not naive, Eleanor assured me. Cautiously optimistic, perhaps. You can rebuild connections without sacrificing boundaries, Cassandra. Trust is earned incrementally through consistent actions over time. June arrived with a magnificent burst of summer blooms throughout Eleanor's gardens, but also with a marked decline in her health. The part-time nurse became full-time, then a team of nurses providing round-the-clock care. I postponed several meetings with Harrison University administrators about fall enrollment to remain close to Eleanor, whose good days were becoming increasingly rare. On one particularly lucid afternoon, as we sat in the library with the summer breeze drifting through open French doors, Eleanor broached a subject we'd both been avoiding. "We need to discuss what happens after I'm gone," she said directly, her voice weaker than before, but her gaze as penetrating as ever. "Not the legal matters. Those are thoroughly arranged, but the personal aspects." I swallowed hard against the tightness in my throat. "Grandma Eleanor?" "No avoidance, Cassandra," she chided gently. "We've always been honest with each other. My time is short. We both know it." Reluctantly, I nodded, forcing myself to meet her eyes. "Good girl," she approved. "First, practical matters. You'll need advisors you can trust implicitly. Edward Harrington will continue to handle legal affairs, but you should develop your own relationship with him rather than relying on his connection to me." She outlined key personnel within the Mitchell businesses and foundation, identifying those she considered trustworthy and those who might resist my leadership. Her assessment was characteristically clear-eyed and unsentimental. "Now, personal considerations," she continued. "After I'm gone, Richard will likely make another attempt to challenge the succession, despite the legal obstacles. Be prepared for this, but don't let it consume you. His challenges come from insecurity, not genuine conviction." "I'll be careful," I promised. "Your mother's overture may be genuine, but proceed cautiously there as well. People can change, but they can also revert when under pressure." Her expression softened slightly. "That said, if Alexandra is truly reclaiming her former self, that relationship may be worth rebuilding. Just maintain your boundaries." I nodded, touched by her concern for my emotional well-being even as she faced her own mortality. "As for your father," Eleanor continued, "that decision is entirely yours. The information and resources are available if you choose to search for him, but don't feel obligated either way. Your identity is your own, Cassandra, shaped by your choices rather than dictated by parentage." "I think I want to read his letters before deciding anything," I said. "To understand who he was, at least." "A sensible approach," she approved. "Finally, and most importantly," her voice faltered briefly before strengthening with determination, "don't allow my legacy to become a burden. The Mitchell fortune is a tool, not a prison. Use it to create the life you want, to support causes you believe in, to make your own mark on the world." I blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the immense responsibility and freedom she was entrusting to me. "I'll do my best to honor what you've built." "No," she corrected gently. "Build something of your own. That's the true purpose of inheritance. Not to preserve the past unchanged, but to provide foundation for new growth." She reached for my hand, her fingers cool and fragile in mine. "Promise me you'll live your life, Cassandra. Not Richard's version. Not Alexandra's. Not even mine. Yours." "I promise," I whispered, my voice breaking as I finally allowed the tears to fall. Eleanor died peacefully 3 weeks later, in her sleep, with me holding her hand. The morning after Eleanor's death, the house felt impossibly empty despite the staff moving quietly through their duties. I sat alone in the library, surrounded by the books she had loved, trying to absorb the reality that she was truly gone. Mr. Harrington arrived before noon, his usual professional demeanor softened by genuine grief. "Mrs. Mitchell was one of the finest people I've ever known," he said simply as we sat together, reviewing the immediate legal steps that needed to be taken. And she had absolute faith in you, Cassandra. Remember that in the difficult days ahead. Those days proved as challenging as Eleanor had predicted. The funeral was a complex social minefield, with Richard and Vanessa maintaining a glacial distance while accepting condolences from Boston's elite. Mom, who now preferred to be called Alexandra, again, attended separately from Richard, standing quietly at the back of the church. I found myself surrounded by Eleanor's trusted advisors and the loyal estate staff, a protective circle that allowed me to grieve without interference. As Eleanor had anticipated, Richard made one final attempt to contest the will, filing legal objections through an aggressive attorney known for taking on difficult inheritance cases. Mr. Harrington calmly dismantled their arguments in court, presenting the extensive documentation of Eleanor's mental competence and the clear legal protections she had established. The judge dismissed Richard's challenge within weeks, cementing my position as Eleanor's rightful heir. The Mitchell social circles initially maintained their distance, uncertain which way the wind would blow in this family power struggle. But as I began stepping into Eleanor's roles, hosting the annual Mitchell Foundation Gala, meeting with long-standing business partners, continuing her philanthropic commitments, many realized that the Mitchell fortune remained a significant force in Boston society, regardless of who controlled it. Vanessa surprised me by reaching out 6 months after Eleanor's death. We met for coffee at a neutral location, away from curious eyes. "I still think it should have been me," she said bluntly, stirring her latte. "But I've had to admit that you're not screwing it up the way Dad predicted." Coming from Vanessa, this was practically effusive praise. "Thanks, I think," I replied, unsure how to navigate this strange truce. "Dad's business is struggling," she continued, a hint of worry breaking through her practiced indifference. "The investors who backed him, because of Grandma's connection, are pulling out. He won't admit it, but things are tight." I nodded, already aware of Richard's financial troubles through the business intelligence networks Eleanor had established. "Is that why you wanted to meet? To ask for help for Richard?" She laughed, a genuine sound I'd rarely heard from her. "God, no. He'd die before accepting anything from you." She hesitated, uncomfortable with vulnerability. "It's about me, actually. I've decided to finish college. For real this time, not just showing up for exams my father paid someone to take for me." The admission clearly cost her pride, but there was something refreshing in her honesty. "That's great, Vanessa. Genuinely." "Yeah, well, turns out having your identity completely tied to being a Mitchell heiress leaves you pretty empty when that falls through." She looked me directly in the eyes for perhaps the first time in our entire relationship. "I need to figure out who I am without all that. Like you always knew who you were, even when we tried to erase you." Her insight was surprisingly perceptive. We weren't friends, too much had happened for that. But some understanding had been reached, a mutual recognition of our shared complicated history with the Mitchell name. My relationship with Mom evolved more gradually. We started with those coffee meetings I'd tentatively agreed to, carefully navigating neutral topics before slowly addressing the deeper wounds between us. She had indeed returned to nursing, taking a position at a community clinic rather than the prestigious hospital where she'd once worked. "The patients there need me more," she explained. "And I need to remember what it means to be useful, not just decorative." 6 months of consistent effort on her part, showing up when she promised, respecting my boundaries, demonstrating through actions rather than words that she was committed to rebuilding trust, earned her an invitation to dinner at Eleanor's estate. My estate now, though I still thought of it as hers. "You've made this place your own," she observed, noticing the subtle changes I'd implemented. Contemporary art alongside the traditional pieces, the formal dining room converted to a modern workspace where I managed the Mitchell holdings. The gardens expanded with native plants Eleanor would have appreciated but never considered. That was what Eleanor wanted, I told her. Not for me to preserve everything exactly as it was, but to build something new on the foundation she left. After dinner, I finally showed Mom the sealed envelope and folder Eleanor had given me about my father. "I've read his letters," I said. "The ones you kept. But I haven't decided whether to try to find him." She nodded, understanding the complexity of that decision. "Whatever you choose, I'll support you this time. Really support you, not just say what I think you want to hear." "I know," I said, and realized I believed her. That autumn, I began my studies at Harrison University while continuing to manage the Mitchell Estate and Foundation. I established a scholarship program for students from backgrounds like my original one, kids from single-parent households without financial advantages. The first recipients included Zoe, who remained my closest friend and fiercest advocate. On the anniversary of Eleanor's death, I visited her grave alone, placing white roses, her favorite, against the elegant stone. "I'm keeping my promise," I told her, the cool autumn breeze catching my words. "I'm building something new, something mine." Richard continued to maintain his distance, too proud to acknowledge my legitimate place in the Mitchell legacy. Vanessa graduated with her own honestly earned degree and found work at a publishing house, establishing an identity separate from both her father and the Mitchell name. As for my father, I eventually decided to write to the last known address, in Thailand. Whether my letter would reach him, whether he would respond, whether any relationship could be built after so many years, these remained unanswered questions. But I had learned from Eleanor that family is both the people who share your blood and the people who see your true worth when others try to erase you. My name is Cassandra Hayes. Not Mitchell, not invisible, not defined by others' attempts to diminish me. In the end, Eleanor's greatest gift wasn't the inheritance but the recognition that I had always been worthy, even when no one else could see it. That was the legacy I would build upon. A foundation of truth rather than appearances, of substance rather than status, of genuine connection rather than social positioning. In the photos I now display throughout the estate, no one is edited out. Every face remains, testament to a history honestly acknowledged. The painful parts alongside the beautiful ones, nothing erased. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.